right, everybody. So welcome to the final week of instruction in our course. We are wrapping things up, and I do apologize for not getting this video out sooner. I've been dealing with a lot of grading for my other course that I'm teaching, but that's all done now, so I'm able to record this for you guys. And today, or this week, we are focusing on the conservative revival in the 1970s and 1980s, and I'm going to be talking a lot about how conservatism as a kind of an ideology revives itself in the 1970s and into the 1980s, and what that, what the results of that were in terms of American politics. And we'll also be wrapping up talking about the end of the Cold War, because we see that, sort of come to a pretty rapid end by the end of the 1980s. So that's kind of where we're ending up in the course this week. So let's get into it. So the 1960s we've been talking about over the past few weeks, and that was really a decade that sees the end or the culmination of post-war liberal idealism. You have Kennedy's New Frontier, you have Johnson's Great Society. The very names scream optimism and progress and idealism, an America that, believes in making life better for everybody, an America that believes in change and progress. And the post-war years really established this pattern of an expansive government made possible by this very, sort of liberal consensus, this idea that, sort of everybody pretty much believes in this. Even the Republican Party at this point in the early part of the 1960s is still believing, sort of that what FDR sort of put in place, the ideas of, the New Deal, were standard. And they were, thought to be, conventional wisdom. The activist state is accepted. It's an idea that, sort of the government should be engaged in committing to protecting people's individual rights, that government should be promoting economic prosperity, that government should be establishing political equality and social justice. These ideas were not questioned throughout most of the 1950s and into the 1960s. And what we see is that in the 1960s, we see a challenge to liberalism from the political left. We see, sort of people on the left side of the political spectrum saying that, liberal reform hadn't done enough, that it was, sort of that you needed to have things come from kind of the grassroots up. And we see all this violence, riots, and police brutality, and kind of the endemic poverty of the inner cities make some Americans question a fundamental premise of liberalism, that Americans have shared fundamental values, that they could work out their differences in a peaceful manner. So this idea kind of is challenged by all the violence that we see in the 1960s. So what we see is many Americans are becoming disenchanted with liberalism by the late 1960s and early 1970s. We have supporters of the military who are looking at the younger generation as being, sort of very they're looking disdainfully at the youth of the era. We have, the hippies, the anti-war protesters. You have parents, mostly northern white ethnics, very much hostile to liberal programs like affirmative action or forced school desegregation. You have born-again Christians who are disturbed about the sexual revolution of the 1960s. You have anti-feminists against the ERA and against ideas of abortion. We have blue-collar workers who become kind of angry about all the money that the government is spending on welfare. You have business interests beginning to resist environmental and economic regulation. And so we are going to see how a movement emerges out of that, the conservative movement, and it arises to kind of take the place of liberalism during the 1970s and into the 1980s. So before we get into that, we're going to talk a little bit about the rise and the fall of what is called the New Deal coalition. Remember, we talked about how during the 1930s, President Roosevelt was able to fashion a rather remarkable political coalition for the Democratic Party that lasted for almost 40 years. So the New Deal coalition included it included white Southerners, it included Northern African Americans, it included white working class ethnics, union members, intellectuals, Catholics, and Jewish Americans. And this diverse collection of people and interests came together under the banner of the Democratic Party because the Great Depression forced people to abandon this idea that you could kind of rely on private enterprise and local government, that just simply wasn't effective enough anymore. Roosevelt's New Deal, even though it was haphazard and kind of hit and miss in terms of success, represented a major expansion of what the federal government could do. And given the context of the times, it seemed like this was what was necessary to keep America afloat. And it was Roosevelt himself who was kind of largely responsible for keeping this New Deal coalition together. His personality, he was, sort of this optimistic guy. He had all this energy. It drew people to his cause, and it nurtured a lot of confidence and faith that government could regulate the economy for the public good. The New Deal coalition, though, begins to break down by the late, as early as the late 1940s. And by the late 1960s, it had collapsed. So how does it begin to collapse? We have to go all the way back to the late 1940s. The first to begin to break away from that coalition were the white Southern segregationists. They are unhappy about the way the Democratic Party is increasingly taking this liberal stance on issues of race. And in 1948, some Southern Democrats bolted. They left their party and they organized what became known as the Dixiecrat Party. They ran Strom Thurmond as their presidential candidate. And this was a avowedly white supremacist party. And Thurmond actually ends up carrying 4 states of the Deep South during that year. So it's breaking that Democratic lock on the South, which they had enjoyed for over 100 years. We also see in the 1940s and 1950s that union power is starting to wane a little bit. So even though unions remain steadfastly loyal to the Democrats, they don't command as much authority as they once had. You also see by the 60s, you see white, ethnic, working class Americans becoming disenchanted with Johnson's Great Society, which was, of course, an extension of the New Deal. Johnson really saw himself as kind of extending the policies of Roosevelt. And as the 1960s wears on, you start to see a lot of, people of that old New Deal coalition kind of becoming disenchanted with these ideas, particularly with programs that benefited the poor and minorities. And so we start to see this kind of coalition begin to break down. Really, from the 1930s all the way up to the 1970s, there's really no viable alternative, though, to New Deal liberalism. Even Republican presidents like Eisenhower essentially support the basic premise of the New Deal, that the federal government should be involved in regulating the economy. The government should, kind of regulate the economy, that the government could stimulate the economy by, putting together public programs and projects, that the government can manage the economy and maximize growth and keep economic problems at bay. And many Americans agreed during the post-war period that it's the federal government's duty to do this, that they have to, promote full employment and raise American living standards. And these ideas were dominant for a really long time in American politics. The political reality of this era was that Democrats controlled Congress for much of this time, and also they controlled the White House for a lot of this period. And it seemed to be working. Economic growth was good. People were prospering. When that economic success starts to break down, as we see happens in the beginning in the early 1970s, people start to shift away from liberalism. So what do they shift to? Well, they shift to ideas which become known as conservatism. So we have to explore what is, sort of the conservative ideology. And we have to go back to kind of the pre-1960 period to explore, sort of what that means. So conservatism, what do we mean by that? It generally describes a political philosophy that favors maintaining or going back to traditional values, religious values, cultural values, or nationally defined beliefs and customs. The 1930s through the 1960s were not happy times for conservatives in America. They were basically outsiders. They were relegated to the fringes of American political life. The Democratic Party was obviously dominated by liberals, and the Republican Party at this time was dominated by a moderate Eastern establishment. They are not conservative at this point. From the 1930s all the way up into the 1960s, they are not a conservative party like they are today. And conservatives are divided among themselves throughout most of this era. They can't agree on a program or an agenda that they want to kind of work on. And they attacked some of these, New Deal programs that were overwhelmingly popular, and that wasn't, that didn't go anywhere. Some of them remained isolationists and kind of, long after the United States had embraced the idea that, the U.S. had to maintain this strong presence in the world. So they're kind of, arguing, off in the dark somewhere that, no, we need to be isolationist. Some of them, start talking about, they're still talking about laissez-faire economics, even though, most people are saying, no, the government should play an active role in the economy. The most vocal critic of liberalism during the late 1940s and early 1950s was Senator Joseph McCarthy. And of course, he goes too far in his anti-communist hysteria, and he ends up being censured by the Senate and ends his career in disgrace. And conservatives during this period in the 1950s, they were mostly divided, they were mostly leaderless, and the main adherents were, kind of fringe figures who were too polarizing to attract a lot of widespread support. And so during this era, it's mostly an intellectual movement, consisting of writers and thinkers like Ayn Rand, and economists like Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman, and they are, kind of putting forward ideas that are pretty different from the sort of Cold War consensus that dominates American society at this time. Ayn Rand, of course, is a Russian immigrant. She was the writer of several novels like The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and she was a very strong supporter of laissez-faire capitalism and individual rights. She thought that the sole function of a proper government should be the protection of the individual's right to life, liberty, and property. So it's this very extreme libertarian philosophy. And she had all kinds of, sort of ideas that were not very popular at the time. She rejected Christianity. She had all kinds of, sort of very wacky and out there ideas about sexuality. And that made her kind of hard to take for a lot of people. Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman, they were kind of more serious academic conservatives. They argued for the free market. They argued against the government regulation of the economy and ideas like you could stimulate the economy by doing public works projects. They argued that this was not the way to go. But again, they don't have a lot of influence at this point. So in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the conservatism as a movement is just beginning to emerge. And there are really two figures, one intellectual and one political, who come on the scene to form the pillars of modern conservatism. The first of these, the intellectual, is William F. Buckley, Jr. And he founds a magazine known as the National Review, and he founds a principal conservative group, which was called the Young Americans for Freedom. And he helps to bring the kind of divided parts of the conservative movement together. Part of the problem that conservatives were having is that it is attempting to kind of unite under a single banner two somewhat contradictory ideologies. You have, on the one hand, the kind of economic conservatives, the libertarians, who believe in very low taxes or even no taxes. They believe in a free market. They believe in a very small government that is only minimally involved in Americans' lives. On the other side, you have religious conservatives, or what we might call social conservatives today. They also believe in low taxes and in a free market, but they want government to regulate personal morality. And in that sense, it's a very different kind of government than the libertarians wanted. The libertarians don't care about personal morality. They don't think the government should be doing anything regulating that. Buckley argues that you can bridge the gap between these two. He argues that both big government and the welfare state undermine human autonomy and morality and economic freedom, and bringing these two sides together has been crucial to the success of the conservative movement. The second kind of major figure in modern conservatism was Barry Goldwater, and we've already talked a little bit about Goldwater. He was an authentic conservative. He was even given the nickname Mr. Conservative. And he advocated positions that were very far to the right of most of his Republican colleagues in the Senate. Now, as you know, Goldwater was overwhelmingly defeated in the 1964 presidential election. And in 1964, Johnson was still at this time pretty popular, and Goldwater was pretty easily painted as something of a nut job. But his candidacy had a real impact on the conservative movement. He energized this generation of conservative activists who would later go on to serve in the Nixon administration and the Reagan administration, and found a lot of new right organizations. You also saw in 1964 the emergence of Ronald Reagan as a political figure. Reagan campaigned for Goldwater. He very much, sort of got behind his effort. And it was really the culmination. Goldwater's candidacy as the Republican nominee for president in 1964 was the culmination of really grassroots efforts by conservatives to take over the Republican Party and transform it into a truly conservative organization. And this is how Goldwater is able to secure the nomination, basically through the efforts of many ordinary conservatives. A lot of them were concentrated in these little pockets of conservatism, Orange County, California, for example. And they succeed in taking over the state's party organizations and mobilizing a massive get-out-the-vote effort. And so these conservatives are able to kind of, latch hold and latch on to the Republican Party and kind of take it over. And this is really beginning with Goldwater. We don't really see the culmination of this until 1980 with Reagan, which we'll get to in a little bit. But it's Goldwater that kind of, starts that transformation of the Republican Party. Conservatives are able to successfully capitalize on some demographic shifts that are happening in America, both economic and demographic population shifts that are happening in America that begin during the post-war era, and they reach their culmination in the 1970s. And this is what's known as the rise of the SUNBELT. Goldwater was from Arizona. And his candidacy in 1964 marked something of a change within the Republican Party. For the first time, the party had nominated someone who was outside of that moderate Eastern establishment. The Republican Party, up till this point, was really dominant in the Northeast. And Goldwater's candidacy really represents the ascendance of the SUNBELT to prominence in American political and social life. So as you can see on the map there, the SUNBELT goes all the way across the lower third of the United States, from California in the west, Southern California in the west, to South Carolina and Florida in the east. And the SUNBELT is characterized above all by development, by these sprawling suburbs and cities that are teeming with new business and new development. In the 1970s, by the 1970s, this was the region of the country that was booming, while the old industrial north, the so-called Rust Belt, was in serious decline. So what are the reasons for the rise of the Sun Belt and the decline of the Rust Belt? Well, it's a major change in Americans' demographic patterns, where people are living. You have the post-war rise of the suburbs. This only accelerates after 1960. The cities, urban areas are becoming economically poorer, and they're becoming racially darker, while suburbs are becoming richer and whiter. And people begin to head south for a variety of reasons. You have retirees moving to warmer climates. You have the growth in military bases. The military-industrial complex of the Cold War is really concentrated in the South. And many who, after they serve in the military, they decide to remain there. You have defense and aerospace industries, all located in that southern third of the United States. This attracted thousands of people because they offered jobs. So thousands of people start going to these southern suburbs. You have laid off industrial workers in the Rust Belt coming to places like Texas or Florida because there are job opportunities there. And what we see is that this really transforms the South. Whereas, up until really World War II, the South had been a predominantly rural, farm-based agricultural economy. Now we have the South being transformed into this high-tech service and industrial labor force. And this happens in part because a lot of people in the South try to make this happen. They help create a favorable business climate, regional, sort of boosters, people who want the South to become an industrial center, create this favorable business climate for industry to come in. And of course, some of it's environmental as well. The South and the Southwest have a lot of really warm weather and abundant resources. And this is really attractive to people. People want to live in, sort of very moderate temperate climates. They want to live in, sort of these areas which are, sort of have a lot of resources. You have not a lot of union presence in the South, and this is promoted by Southern and Western governments. And so the labor costs are very low in the South. And you have state governments, trying to promote jobs and factories to come in and giving special incentives and promotions to businesses. The decisive factor here, though, is government action. And this is ironic because with this region becoming heavily kind of this conservative region of the country, it becomes this anti-government region. And yet it's very heavily dependent on the federal contracts and government assistance for all of this success, all of this economic boom that's happening. You have large-scale agriculture, the oil industry, defense and technology firms. These are all dependent on federal money, federal programs and spending for their success. And SUNBELT politicians, members of Congress from these regions cultivate these links. So they argue, for putting in more military bases in their region. You have, of course, the space program is kind of the clearest example of the government, the federal government, developing this region of the country and using, sort of government action as a tool for regional development. So the space program is all concentrated in Southern California, in Texas, in Alabama, in Florida. It's all concentrated in that Sun Belt region. So the South and the West become this seedbed of the new conservative movement. And they become really the foundation for a generation of Republican dominance in national politics. Because you have all of this economic growth, that brings more people. That leads to more congressional seats. That leads to more electoral votes, more political power. If you've ever wondered why Florida has such a huge, sort of impact on American national politics, it's partly because of the Sun Belt. It's partly because, you have this kind of, sort of dominant region. And every president elected since JFK, with the exception of the current president and the previous president, Obama, came from the Sun Belt region. So every single president, from JFK onward up to Obama had come from this region of the country. The solid Democratic South is now a thing of the past. And the Republican Party enjoys the fruits of all of this Southern economic development. You have businessmen, professionals, managers, engineers. These are a natural constituency for the GOP. And all of this booming Southern economy helps to raise money for conservative causes and raise money for the Republican Party. And so this is this new brand of conservatism. It's no longer dominated by the wealthy elites of the Northeast. It's now more populist. It's more middle class. It's more anti-establishment. And you see a reassertion of kind of Southern cultural identity during this era, regional pride. Sweet Home Alabama is, a really popular song. You have the Dukes of Hazzard on America's television screens. You have the South kind of joining the national mainstream on questions of race relations. So the kind of worst excesses of Southern racism had now been outlawed, and African Americans now had the right to vote. And they use it. They elect a lot of African American politicians in the South. And so everybody kind of comes to the consensus that, okay, well, maybe we've put some of this, sort of these ugly racism of the past behind us. Now, of course, that wasn't true, but it does come to be, sort of put on the back burner a little bit. All right, so what are some of the specific issues on the conservative agenda in the 1970s and 1980s? There are really kind of three main areas of concern for conservatives. The first of these was national defense. A lot of conservatives really resented and resisted the fact that America was losing international dominance in the wake of Vietnam. They did not like the idea that America was, sort of becoming less of a world power. So they didn't like, sort of negotiating with the Soviet Union. They didn't trust the Chinese. They wanted America, to kind of reassert itself as a dominant world power. So they opposed things like arms control. They favor building up the American military. So that's kind of one area that conservatives argue for. There's also a sort of general kind of anti-elitism and kind of class resentment that conservatives embrace. Now, traditionally, conservatives they were kind of suspicious of grassroots activism. They drew a lot of support from wealthy elites, while liberals were the ones who thought they were kind of supportive of democratic participation and drawing support from the poor and the disenfranchised. Conservatives in the 1970s managed to reverse these stereotypes. They are able to link liberals as being elitist, as being kind of the establishment, and they ally themselves with the so-called ordinary people. And this manifests itself in conservative action and rhetoric in a lot of ways. So there's a lot of resentment against bureaucrats. Conservatives talk about, sort of intellectuals as being kind of the architects of all these liberal programs that conservatives so vehemently opposed. We see challenges over education, challenges over what's going to be in people's textbooks, over what's going to be in school curricula, over what books are going to be in school libraries. You have a lot of attacks on the kind of, leftist universities and against the national news media. This is where that sort of rhetoric that, the liberal media begins to start here. And, sort of this becomes kind of one, facet of the conservative agenda movement. And then, of course, you have family values. Conservatives basically charge the liberal establishment with all of the immorality and the, deviance that they see going on in American society. And this manifests itself in a number of ways. So you have textbook protests. You have a lot of local efforts during the 70s and 80s to kind of remove supposedly immoral textbooks or library books to purify the curriculum in public schools. For example, in 1974 in West Virginia, a conservative woman named Alice Moore, she fought her local school district for having a sex education program, and she won election to the local school board, and she was able to reform the curriculum. She removed a lot of controversial authors from the assigned readings. You also have the establishment of this really conservative network. And, sort of a lot of organizations that help to kind of coordinate all of this. You have protests against homosexuality, especially against civil rights protections for gay people in general and teachers in particular. For example, in 1977, the singer and actress Anita Bryant, she led a campaign in Miami to repeal Miami's gay rights ordinance. And this was funded by this whole, kind of conservative network of organizations that was established. And they helped Bryant sort of build this organization called Save Our Children, which was this anti-gay organization. And she's able to kind of mount similar efforts across the country. And this only helps to kind of strengthen the connections between evangelical Christianity and politics, which is what I'm going to talk about now. So during this era, one of the main components of the conservative agenda we see is the rise of the Christian right. The 1970s sees this widespread era of religious revival. And some people have called this the Third Great Awakening. And that refers to these periodic trends in American history where you see kind of religious fervor gripping the country. And there have been at least 3 Great Awakenings in American history. The first one happened in the 1730s and 1740s, so right kind of before we start to get all of the fervor of the American Revolution. The Second Great Awakening happens between really in the 1820s and 1830s, so about, almost 100 years later. The Third Great Awakening is really seen to have started in kind of the 1970s, and in some ways it goes all the way up to the present. And so what happens with kind of American evangelical Christianity during the 70s, it's this emphasis, this kind of revival of, fundamentalist sort of thinking, the sanctity of Scripture, the same kind of fundamentalist ideas that we saw in the 1920s with the Scopes trial. We see this kind of, reviving in the 1970s. You have, kind of the experience, it's kind of stressing the idea of sort of having a personal conversion, being born again. And this manifests itself in popular culture during the era. You have all kinds of religious music. You have the rise of the Christian music industry. You have Christian bookstores popping up all over the place. You have this sort of evangelical subculture developing. And this is when you start to see the first so-called mega churches coming into play. You have schools, Christians, private schools, sort of being established. You have all these conservative organizations, missionary groups, and that kind of thing. You have televangelists and religious media coming on the scene as well. And in 1979, this kind of culminates with the founding of a group called the Moral Majority. And it was founded by the Reverend Jerry Falwell, whom you can see there on the right. This was an explicitly political religious lobbying group. And Falwell basically said, we're going to lobby for Christian values, and we're going to support candidates who have these so-called Christian values in American society. And this group really played a key role in securing Ronald Reagan's presidential nomination in 1980, and in moving the Republican Party more to the right, more on the side of conservatism. The other kind of big issue that helps to unite the different factions of conservatism and cement its agenda and broaden its base is the tax revolt in the 1970s. Property taxes become this huge issue in the 70s. And this starts in California. California, of course, part of the SUNBELT. It was this huge booming economy. And so property values were really going up. And this leaves homeowners with huge increases in property taxes. And this becomes a major statewide issue in 1965 when the San Francisco Chronicle publishes an expose on corruption in the tax assessors. And this prompts reform of the state's tax system. These corrupt assessors had been overtaxing businesses to keep homeowners' taxes low and ensure that they would win their elections. So when these reforms were implemented, businesses start receiving tax cuts and homeowners' taxes start to increase. This prompts people to found an organization called the United Organization of Taxpayers. And they say, we don't want to pay any more property taxes. They attempt to abolish all property taxes altogether in the state. They are not particularly successful initially, but they are very determined to keep at it. By the early 1970s, of course, now you have runaway inflation. And so the political climate has started to shift, and it's started to shift more in favor of this idea of, the government of, not paying so many taxes. So you have this new generation of tax protesters emerging. They're demanding that, they get, sort of these property tax cuts. And this offers conservatives an opening. It's a chance to capitalize on all of this kind of, resentment against government and attacking kind of waste and corruption. And so having tax cuts is a way to kind of cut government without slashing essential services. So if you, cut people's taxes, then there's just simply, sort of not as much money going to the government. And so they can't fund all of these programs that are seen as being wasteful and kind of corrupt. And so this all culminates in the passage of a law known as Proposition 13. This was a law that was put on the ballot in California in 1978, and it called for a major cut in property taxes. And it won broad support across the ideological spectrum among all economic strata. Now, opponents of the law, they claimed that there would be drastic cuts in social services and education. But the fact that the state at that time had a massive budget surplus, this seemed to say, people said, okay, well, we'll still have enough money. And so the effects of Proposition 13 were really pretty widespread. It went beyond just California. Of course, so they passed Proposition 13, tax revenues went down dramatically. But because there was this surplus, immediately, sort of the declines in services did not immediately materialize. And so this was immediately seen as kind of the start of this national tax revolt. It prompted other voters in other states to initiate their own tax rebellions, to pass their own legislation. So this moves beyond the SUNBELT and goes into, other parts of the nation as well. One of the kind of, results of this is that there are some difficult cutbacks that are made, particularly in unprotected sort of areas that don't have a lot of lobbying power, like public libraries, mental health services, facilities for the disabled, sort of extracurricular programs in schools. They start to get cut as a result of these, sort of lowering of taxes. So this really marks the acceptance of the idea that the conservatives have been pushing, that they were sort of critiquing the idea of big government. And so a lot of people buy into the idea that you can have both low taxes and kind of widespread prosperity. And so this becomes, sort of kind of a widespread acceptance. And it's sort of a reversal of that old idea that you should have, kind of a larger government approach in the economy. Now, of course, America in the 1970s is going through a lot of economic problems. And how do conservatives kind of respond to this? They sought to reduce business taxation, to eliminate regulations, to curb the influence of labor unions. And of course, this all ends up shifting a lot of support to the Republican Party. Corporations kind of move away from the Democrats and towards Republicans at this point. Corporations, of course, are against government regulation because, of course, it raises their costs. And, because the government is kind of seen as being more on the side of the unions and less on the side of business. So corporations begin to hire lobbyists in Washington. They put money into political action committees for corporate-friendly candidates. And they are able to kind of fund the creation of this conservative counter-establishment of nonprofit foundations and policy institutes that are set in place to promote policies that are pro-business, that are low taxes, that are in favor of deregulation. Economists begin to kind of reject the idea behind liberalism's economic theory. They argue that prosperity and freedom requires less government spending and regulation. And this is the whole idea of kind of supply-side economics. Supply-siders promise that they're going to solve the problem of stagflation by giving tax cuts to businesses and wealthy individuals to promote savings and investment and growth of the economy as a whole. So supply side economists argue that if we give these tax cuts to these, businesses and wealthy individuals, that eventually this will end up stimulating the economy because they will put that money back into their businesses. They will put that money back into, sort of purchasing power. And that, you had to kind of find just the right tax rate in order to do this. Now, of course, critics said, well, this is going to just create enormous budget deficits, which of course it ends up doing. But this is kind of, what we end up seeing with the tax cuts and the ideas. So all of this kind of conservative ascendance in American politics ends up culminating in the 1980 presidential election. In this election, the current president, Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, he is facing the 1980 presidential election with a disapproval rating of 77%. And this was as a result of a combination of both the economic troubles that the country was in, sort of largely due to this continuing energy crisis and the problem of stagflation, and a series of international crises, especially the Iran hostage crisis, that creates widespread anxiety and frustration and anger among the American public. And in the 1980 election, Carter is facing Ronald Reagan, who was, of course, a former actor in Hollywood, turned now politician. Reagan had been the governor of California for 8 years. He had first ran for president in 1976 and been unsuccessful in getting the nomination. He was kind of seen as the heir to Barry Goldwater's conservative mantle. And he could count on support from this growing right wing of the Republican Party. And this kind of, Reagan has their support, but he's also able to win the support of most of the country because he is very, sort of skillful at using the media. Obviously, he's an actor, so he can kind of, he knows how to be in front of a camera. He has this easygoing manner in contrast with Carter. And he wins basically a landslide, as you can see. He wins the presidency with 51% of the vote to Carter's 41%. 7% went to a third-party candidate that year, John Anderson, who was a moderate Republican congressman from Illinois who ran as an independent. And in the Electoral College, it's pretty dismal. 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49. So it's basically a landslide there. Now, Reagan comes into office declaring that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And this really reflects this conservative ideology that stresses private initiative and enterprise over public or government solutions. Reagan is really coming in hoping to revive the era of the 1920s that had been dominated by conservative republicanism, by this, sort of push for traditional cultural values, by limited government, by an economy that was controlled by corporations. And so he comes in and he works to halt or even reverse a lot of the New Deal's accomplishments and legacies. He also comes in really determined to restore American pride and prestige in the world. He argues that the U.S. should again become active and assertive in opposing communism. And he's kind of rooted in that Cold War tradition. He had a long history of anti-communism. When he was an actor in Hollywood, he had been one of the, sort of leading proponents testifying against communists during the, HUAC hearings. And so he comes in, he takes a very public stance against the Soviet Union. He calls it an evil empire. He says that communism is on its last legs. And so he comes in, sort of wanting to kind of reverse some of that détente that we saw in the 1970s. Even though he's a conservative and he's in favor of smaller government, he ends up advocating increasing military budgets. He ends up, advocating for unprecedented defense spending and this massive arms buildup. And so over a 5-year period, his administration sought a military budget of $1.6 trillion. He argued that the country is vulnerable, that the Soviet Union had been allowed to massively increase their nuclear arsenal, and he, sort of claims that Americans would be able to, by all this defense spending, be able to prevail in the event of a nuclear war. Now, he's discounting all kinds of new scientific studies that were put out that showed that nuclear war would lead to something called nuclear winter, where, sort of would cause drastic changes in the climate. Reagan comes in, he says, no, we need to, sort of escalate things. All right, so the conservative Republicans under Reagan have assumed power by 1980. What do they try to do with that power? So in 1981, Reagan persuades Congress to reduce the top tax rate from 70% to 50%. And 5 years later, in 1986, the Tax Reform Act reduces the rate on the wealthiest Americans down to 28%. And so, again, this is a retreat from this idea that the wealthy should pay a higher percentage of income in taxes than other citizens. So they cut taxes. It's one thing. They also come in and they deregulate. One of the prime targets is government deregulation, returning more power back to the private sector. And this is, of course, a classic conservative position. Conservatives want a smaller government. It's less involved, at least when it comes to financial issues in people's lives. Of course, one of the big legacies of the New Deal and the Great Society is that you have government regulation of business and the environment and the economy. And in the 1980s, Reagan and the Republicans and the conservative Republicans, they seek to roll back a lot of the regulation that had been put in place over the last 50 years. Reagan comes in and he takes this, sort of pretty far. He and his advisors saw almost all government regulation as being anti-competitive, as being not good for the economy. So they cut the budgets for a lot of the regulatory agencies. Some of these agencies were cut so drastically they couldn't even enforce regulations, even if they'd wanted to. Reagan comes in and he appoints a number of heads to these agencies, particularly in the area of environmental regulation, who are hostile to the regulations that they are supposed to enforce. And so that obviously has the effect of, decreasing the amount that these agencies are going to do. Reagan's economics was known by its proponents as supply-side economics. It's also known as trickle-down theory. And so this basically argues that, you can cut taxes on, businesses and the wealthy to stimulate private investment. And this kind of really begins an era of hostility between the federal government and organized labor. In August of 1981, when 13,000 members of PATCO, which was the Union of Air Traffic Controllers, began a strike, which was in violation of federal law, Reagan comes in, he fires them all. And he says he's going to bring in the military to oversee the air traffic system until new air traffic controllers can be brought in. And so this is really this kind of signal that, Reagan is very, the Reagan administration is very hostile to unionization. And this inspires a lot of private employers to launch anti-union offensives. And so we start to see, decline of unions even further in this period. All of these relaxed regulations lead to some very controversial policies and even some outright scandals in government agencies during the 1980s. The biggest and most memorable, of course, is the S&L scandal. And this was resulted from, kind of just a huge amount of deregulation of the savings and loan industry. But even though, Reagan was the one to kind of, put all these ideas into place, he doesn't face a lot of, criticism from it. He's called the Teflon president because, he doesn't, kind of suffer any serious repercussions politically from it. Initially, when Reagan comes in, the country is, immediately experiencing this kind of very severe economic recession. But by 1983, the economy seemed to be kind of on the right track again. Corporations are becoming more profitable. The rate of inflation starts to decline. Prices go down gas prices start to go down. And this really, of course, has nothing to do with Reagan, but he's able to kind of reap the political benefits of it. the stock market rises. But you can see here how the changes in families' real income over the decade of the 1980s is most seen for the wealthiest Americans. You have the most change in income growing for the wealthiest Americans, the next to wealthiest, and still the middle class. But the poorest Americans are actually seeing a drop in their income. And this is reflected in a huge kind of homeless crisis that begins to, sort of come into play in the 1980s. Conservatives boast that the Reaganomics had put the country back on a course toward economic prosperity. You have consumer spending booming. You have the rise of new discount stores like Walmart. But with the rise of stores like these, you have, of course, the decline and the demise of, sort of local mom and pop stores who can't compete with the big retailers for price and selection. And the reason why prices are so low at stores like Walmart is because the goods being sold are not made in the United States. They're made in low-wage foreign factories. So we start to see U.S. manufacturing jobs beginning to leave America. And workers can't do much about this because there are only a few unionized industries that can pressure the government to do something about the growing share of the American domestic goods market being eaten up by foreign-made products. As a candidate, of course, Reagan came in, as he was campaigning, he comes in, he criticizes Carter for having a huge deficit and a growing national debt. And he says that the reason why we have this deficit is because, there's all this wasteful spending on social entitlement programs. But under the Reagan and then the Bush administration, the deficit continues to grow. It climbs to $300 billion, and the national debt goes up to $4 trillion. And a lot of this is because of all of those massive defense spending increases and the tax cuts that Reagan put in play. The policy of cutting taxes and yet keeping some of those popular entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare makes the deficit problem only worse. And to make it seem like the government is, cutting wasteful spending, the government makes mostly kind of small cuts to programs that are really just designed to kind of help poor people. So the money to fund this deficit has to come from somewhere. So you don't see as many dollars available for research, for new plants and factories, for new machinery. So this means that domestic manufacturing and therefore exports are declining, and we begin to run up a massive trade deficit. And domestic manufacturers simply can't compete, so they end up cutting jobs. So it's this real vicious cycle. One area where costs are cut is in federal aid to the states. Under Reagan's administration, the idea is to kind of allow state and local governments to assume more power and responsibility. So practically, this meant shifting a lot of the costs to the states. So ordering states to pay the cost of, duties that the federal government had taken care of up to now. So these policies end up resulting in an enormous amount of economic inequality. 40% of the nation's wealth is now owned by the richest 1%. And the income of middle-class families is stagnating. The poorest fifth of the population ends up declining. And cuts to programs that help the poor and the mentally ill result in this huge increase in the nation's homeless population. So a lot of the problems, or some of the problems that we see in our economy today, stem from this era in American history. Now, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about Reagan's foreign policy here. And so one of the things that Reagan is sometimes characterized, or sometimes characterizes people's, sort of takes on Reagan's foreign policy, is that he was fighting an economic Cold War. By the 1980s, the Soviet economy is kind of in pretty dire straits because Soviet success as an industrial power was founded largely upon exploiting natural resources of the Soviet Union. And that meant that the nation couldn't produce enough food to feed its population, so they had to import food and export things like oil and precious metals. So by the 1980s, this imbalance is threatening to collapse the Soviet economy. The growth rate is declining, standards of living are going down, there's this technology divide between the Soviet bloc and Western nations. The Soviet economy is just simply not able to keep up. It can command labor and natural resources, but it's not promoting creativity, it's not promoting innovation. And Soviet leaders were so afraid of allowing any political or economic competition from market forces that they keep a lot of the technological advancements that had happened out of their country. So they're not being able to compete. And Reagan comes in, he says, well, we can target some of these economic vulnerabilities of the Soviets. So he attempts to kind of punish the Soviets economically. One of the things he does is he cuts off Soviet access to U.S. technology and credit. He pressures U.S. allies to cancel or restrict sales of new technology to the Soviets. He encourages U.S. arms sales to countries like Saudi Arabia as an incentive for them to expand their oil production to compete with the Soviets. And this is perhaps part of kind of a strategy to win the Cold War through economic means. The long-term consequences of this is that what we see is, okay, so we're pressuring the Saudis to boost their oil production. This drives down the price of oil. Falling prices mean that, sort of American oil production is really devastated. You have, you have huge kind of economic imbalance there. And at the same time, sort of Reagan is building up the American military. He's financing this huge military buildup and at the same time cutting taxes. So he's trying to kind of do this without, having the deficit growing even larger. So what the U.S. Treasury begins to do is begins to borrow from foreign investors and governments. So the Japanese, the Saudi Arabians, the Germans, other foreign sources purchase American Treasury notes and bonds to finance the American deficit. And basically, this transforms the U.S. from the biggest creditor nation in the world to the biggest debtor nation in the world. And so this is one of the kind of consequences of Reagan's economic Cold War. And I've talked about how Reagan attempted to kind of, build up the military hugely. And part of this had to do with American nuclear technology. And this gets us into talking about the so-called Strategic Defense Initiative. In 1983, Reagan comes in, he proposes SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was a space-based computer-controlled defense system to eliminate nuclear missiles before they reach their targets. And this is something that one of the nation's leading nuclear physicists, a guy named Edward Teller, whom you can see up here, he's the so-called father of the H-bomb, father of the hydrogen bomb. He begins lobbying for this system, the Strategic Defense Initiative. And he gets Reagan's approval for it. Teller was accused of kind of deliberately overselling this program. A lot of scientists disagreed with him. They said that, so this was not going to work. It was going to be dangerous because it would destabilize the whole system of kind of mutual deterrence that the U.S. and the Soviet Union had put in place. And it was labeled so-called Star Wars. And this was kind of a derisive label that, sort of people put on it. The Soviets, of course, did not like this idea at all. They said that this new program would elevate the arms race, and they insisted that any arms control agreement had to begin with Americans abandoning SDI. Reagan argued that the Soviets had developed their own system of missile defense, and that he said, so this was a major bone of contention between the U.S. and the Soviets at this point. Eventually, the budget for this program was scaled back, but it hasn't entirely ever gone away. And it was this kind of very controversial attempt by the Reagan administration to kind of escalate the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Overall, Reagan's approach to foreign policy becomes known as the Reagan Doctrine. Reagan's advisors, his foreign policy advisors, come in and they argue that we can use force to try to overthrow communism, to overthrow Soviet-supported countries, especially in newly emerging nations. They argued, sort of that the Soviets would not kind of move toward democracy unless they were pressured by military force. And so this kind of view really fits in with Reagan's belief that the U.S. has this mission to spread democracy around the world. So the Reagan Doctrine first becomes articulated in 1985. It's this idea that the U.S. is going to support opponents of communism anywhere in the world, whether or not that regime was tied in any way to the Soviet Union. And so we see this kind of new activism in the third world emerging from this. And now to avoid getting drawn into another conflict like Vietnam, they put forward the idea that you could have these kind of low-intensity conflicts using small, specially trained counterinsurgency forces to kind of wear down your opponents. And this is a relatively cheap and low-key kind of approach to fighting the Cold War, so most Americans are not paying a lot of attention to what they're doing. This policy was then tested in places like the Middle East, in Grenada, in Libya, and most importantly in Nicaragua. And particularly in Nicaragua, the Reagan Doctrine leads the administration into some very questionable involvements. It might have kept the U.S. from getting involved in kind of Vietnam-like scenarios, but it doesn't mean that the Reagan administration is going to be exempt from the kind of machinations and corruption that had plagued the United States in prior attempts to oppose communism in the third world countries. And so this leads us into looking at this one particular example of Nicaragua, Reagan and the so-called Sandinistas. Reagan enters office in 1981, and he condemns this group known as the Sandinistas for joining with Cuba in support of Marxist revolutionary movements in other Latin American countries, notably in El Salvador. And Reagan authorizes the CIA to begin financing and arming and training rebels in Nicaragua, known as the Contras, to fight the ruling Sandinista party. The Contras were operating out of camps in neighboring countries like Honduras and Costa Rica. And basically what the CIA and the Contras were doing was kind of engaging in this campaign of economic sabotage in an attempt to combat the Sandinista government and disrupt, the economy there. The U.S. is also trying to put economic pressure on the Sandinistas. We impose a trade embargo on Nicaragua. As the Contras begin to attack, essentially what we did here was we started a civil war in Nicaragua. And the Sandinistas, they begin by building up their military, by strengthening their political hold on the country, and they start to receive aid from places like the Soviet Union. The CIA comes in, and takes over operations and what's going on in Nicaragua in 1983. And the CIA the failure of the Contras to counter the Sandinistas leads the CIA to come in and kind of take over operations. But when Congress learns about this, they vote that they're going to cut off U.S. aid to the Contras in Nicaragua. Now, this leads us into another important episode or scandal in the Reagan administration, which is the Iran-Contra affair. So, in 1983, to explain what happened here, in 1983, the Middle East terrorist group Hezbollah took 30 hostages, and 6 of these hostages were Americans. Now, Reagan, of course, had come in, and he had criticized his predecessor, Carter, for negotiating the release of the Iranian hostages. And he said he would never, ever negotiate with terrorists. Secretly, though, he's planning to sell arms to Iran in exchange for the Iranians influencing Hezbollah to release the hostages. So Reagan secretly accepts this plan that we're going to sell arms to the country of Iran. We're going to ask Iran in return for that to influence Hezbollah to release the hostages. So we're not negotiating with Hezbollah directly, but we're kind of, going this back channel route to try to, sort of get Hezbollah to release the hostages. Where it becomes really tricky is that it becomes out that in 1985 that a National Security Council aide, a guy named Oliver North, he is a military aide to the National Security Council. He comes up with a new plan. Now that he says, we're going to sell arms to Iran. How are we going to, sort of finance this? We're going to sell arms to Iran, and the proceeds from that sale, the money from that sale, is now going to go to the Contras in Nicaragua. So Congress, of course, remember, has said, no more funding for the Contras in Nicaragua. We're not going to fund this anymore. To get around that, Oliver North says, okay, well, we can just take that money that we're earning from those arms sales that we're doing to Iran. We're going to channel those profits to the Contras in Nicaragua. And this plan is put into effect. Now, at first, the Iranians refused to buy because the U.S. has inflated the prices on these arms, but eventually the sale goes through. The profits are diverted to the Contras. All of this is being coordinated by Oliver North. Both of these policies, both the sale of the weapons to Iran and the funding of the Contras, violates stated administration policy. The administration has said, we are not doing any of this stuff. And also, it violates legislation that had been passed by Congress. And the deal that they made did not accomplish the goal of securing the release of the hostages. The Iranians don't end up really, doing much with Hezbollah to try to get the hostages released. This whole arrangement is exposed in November of 1986. And the operation is only discovered to be after an airlift of guns is brought down over Nicaragua. So it turns out that this airlift, sort of been, financed by the U.S. These guns had come from the U.S. The Iranian government confirms the story. 10 days later, Reagan goes on national television and he says, okay, well, yeah, we were selling arms to Iran, but we weren't doing it in exchange for hostages. And, he says, our government has a firm policy not to capitulate to terrorist demands. We did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we. Now, of course, that's a complete lie. The scandal compounded when Oliver North and his secretary ends up trying to obstruct justice by shredding a number of documents. And finally, the Attorney General goes before Congress and he says, okay, yeah, we did try to divert these profits from the arms sales to the Contras. North is fired. A number of administration officials end up having to resign. Reagan is under a lot of pressure from Congress and the media. He appoints a presidential commission to look into this affair. And eventually this commission determines that, Reagan may not have known about this plan, but he did not do, enough to control his staff. And they basically say, okay, well, sort of a lot of this was illegal, and Reagan should have, really been a little bit more on the ball here. And North and his boss, National Security Advisor John Poindexter, are indicted on multiple charges in 1988, and they are found guilty on a number of those charges, but their convictions are overturned on a technicality. Reagan goes on TV again. He expresses, regret in this nationally televised press conference. He said, okay, well, what I previously said about the U.S. not trading arms for hostages, that might have been incorrect. And he also stated that his vice president, George Bush, knew about this. And Reagan ends up surviving this scandal. His approval ratings go back up to previous levels, but it is pretty damaging to a lot of his administration. Now, how did all of this result in the end of the Cold War? Well, what we see is in a lot of the end of the Cold War, all of this stuff is going on in U.S. foreign policy. There are kind of immense changes happening in the Soviet Union. And this is the kind of transfer of power, new Soviet leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. He came to power in 1985 after this very long series of very ineffectual Soviet leaders. We don't really, have to go over all their names because nobody remembers who they were. He is able to, he was the first Soviet leader to have been born after the Russian Revolution of 1917. So he really represents kind of a new generation of Soviets who are demanding some new thinking about their policies. These are, people who had become adults after Stalin had died. They are well educated. They are kind of inspired by some of the attempts to initiate reforms that had been put in place in the 1950s. They argue that the Soviet Union is falling behind the West technologically. So Gorbachev comes in and he proposes two new kind of policy agendas known as perestroika, which was economic reform, and glasnost, which is a term that means openness. So these reforms that Gorbachev puts in place, he calls for kind of more independence, revamping the whole kind of Soviet economy, allowing for some private, industry a little bit, cooperating with Western corporations. Now he's facing some opposition, obviously from kind of more traditional party members, but he really believes that he recognizes that these economic reforms that he wants to put in place demands that the the arms race with the United States is going to have to be put to an end. And so he ends up starting to pursue détente-like policies with the United States. And so this new Soviet leadership comes in. Now, of course, Reagan had come into office in the early 1980s saying the Soviets are an evil empire and we cannot negotiate with them and they're, horrible. He had escalated tension with the Soviet Union to the point where many Americans are seriously afraid that there's going to be nuclear war. Going into his second term, Reagan kind of softens his stance a little bit. And this, combined with Gorbachev's reforms, allows for kind of a new, more friendly relationship between the U.S. and the Soviets. Reagan realizes that Gorbachev is kind of a new generation. He can deal with him. And so we start to see kind of softening of his anti-communist rhetoric, and we start to see meetings and agreements being put in place between Reagan and Gorbachev. They first hold a summit meeting in 1985 in Geneva, and they agree to some cuts to some of their military forces, to reopen some cultural exchange programs. Then in 1986, they have a historic summit in Reykjavik, and this produces an agreement that was designed to eliminate all intermediate range missiles in Europe. And they nearly agreed to eliminate all nuclear missiles, which is a huge thing. But the program ends up falling through when Gorbachev insists that the U.S. renounce the SDI program, and Reagan says, no, we're not going to give that up. Then again in 1987, they meet in Washington. They sign a treaty eliminating more nuclear missiles. In 1988, Reagan makes history. He goes to Moscow on a goodwill trip, and he meets with Gorbachev later that year again in Washington. And so we start to see, sort of some of this thawing of the Cold War in the late 1980s. And all of this kind of results, a lot of this results in, what comes to be seen as the end of the Cold War. In March of 1989, Gorbachev allows the first free elections in the Soviet Union since 1917. This meant that for the first time, Soviets could vote for other political parties. And the result of this, of course, is that a lot of the Communist Party candidates are defeated and discontent is spreading. The economic problems of the Soviet Union are mounting. Now, there's this danger that if the Soviet Union falls apart, chaos and possible catastrophe are going to ensue if nuclear weapons of the Soviet Union gets into the wrong hands. Gorbachev is also forced to relax a lot of the influence that the Soviet Union had over Eastern Europe. And this results in one communist government after another toppling. Poland is first. In April of 1989, the Solidarity Movement, under the leadership of Lech Walesa, you can see up there on the right, This became a legal political party. It begins winning elections. Reformers in Hungary drive out the communists. They set free elections. Then you see regimes collapsing in Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania. And finally, the communists hold over East Germany. So when the new kind of Hungarian prime minister comes in, he says, okay, we're not going to maintain the border no longer between Hungary and Austria. We're actually going to take down that border. Word about this spreads, and pretty soon thousands of East Germans are taking their spring and summer vacations in Hungary and conveniently crossing over the border into Austria from there. And by September, there are 130,000 East Germans in Hungary. So you have this massive influx of East Germans basically fleeing the country. Because of this, the East German government decides to relax, but not eliminate, the rules restricting travel to West Germany. But when this new policy is made public at a press conference, the spokesman for the East German government makes a mistake. And he says that the East Germans are free to leave immediately through any of the border crossings. Now, once word of this gets out, thousands of people start to gather at the Berlin Wall, and the border guards, they don't know what to do. Finally, one of the guards at the crossings decides he's going to open the gates, and East Berliners are free to cross. And soon you have thousands of East Berliners from both sides are gathering at the wall, and they're beginning to actually knock it down. And this is just an extraordinary moment in history. So November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall is opened. It's destroyed. You have the huge celebrations going on in Germany, as you can see there. Eventually, Germany becomes reunited. And this is all happening just very, very rapidly. And what's the American response to all this staggering change? Well, the U.S. is kind of taken off guard a little bit. We're surprised. We're not prepared to face the end of the Cold War. And these two maps kind of give you a sense of what that meant. So we see Eastern Europe during and after the Cold War. On the left, you have Eastern Europe during the Cold War. So as you can see here, controlled by the Soviet Union. This was the Soviet bloc. East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. All of these countries controlled by the Soviet Union. Now, after the Cold War, new countries spring up. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, the Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary, all these countries, new independent states, sort of gaining independence and, becoming their own powers. Now, as this is going on, the other communist world power, China, is also experiencing its own pro-democracy demonstrations in the spring and summer of 1989. So this is a really pivotal moment. In April, tens of thousands of students demonstrate in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, demanding greater democracy. And as you can see in this photo, the students create this figure that's very similar to the Statue of Liberty. They call it the goddess of democracy and freedom. So all these protests are going on. In June, the Chinese government sends in troops to crush the protests. And this is, of course, the famous photo on the right there of this unknown demonstrator standing defiantly in front of a line of tanks. And this becomes kind of a symbol for the protests all over the world. Unfortunately, possibly thousands of people are killed by the Chinese military during this crackdown on the protests, and eventually they end up dying away. So China is still, sort of communist at this point. The Cold War doesn't, result in the fall of communism in China. So this kind of leads us to the question, well, why does the Cold War end? Is it Reagan's hardline anti-communism that's the primary cause for the Soviet Union's demise? Is it Gorbachev's reforms that are responsible? Is it the relative decline in both American and Soviet power in their international system? Is that the critical factor? Or is it ordinary people? Is it ordinary people shedding oppression and embracing freedom? I think you can answer, the answer to, all of these questions might be yes. But I think, so the last question is really the one that's, sort of maybe the most interesting and the most kind of, inspiring. And one historian has sort of put it, he said, what no one understood at the beginning of 1989 was that the Soviet Union, its empire, its ideology, and therefore the Cold War itself was a sand pile ready to slide. And all it took to make that happen were a few more grains of sand. And the people who dropped those grains of sand were not in charge of superpowers or movements or religions. They're ordinary people with very simple priorities who saw and seized and sometimes stumbled into opportunities. And in doing so, they caused a collapse that no one could stop. And their leaders had very little choice but to follow them. So if we're going to look at the question of why the Cold War ended, I don't think we can discount the actions of kind of ordinary people in Eastern Europe, who basically seized democracy and seized their freedom and took the opportunity. Now, all of this results in what becomes known as the so-called New World Order at the end of the Cold War. What changes after the Soviet Union collapses and the Cold War comes to an end, and how does American foreign policy adjust? Well, it's a tricky situation. The world remains very dangerous and unstable after the end of the Cold War. In some cases, even more so, because the balance of power during the Cold War is now gone. So things have been destabilized to a certain extent. American military interventions around the world continue, but now they become justified for other reasons. It's no longer containing communism. Now we are coming to the defense of human rights. We're giving humanitarian aid. We are trying to protect our energy supplies. We are trying to suppress the drug trade. And Americans in the early 90s begin to discover that there are some unpleasant side effects to the end of the Cold War. You have, kind of reduced military spending. But of course, this hits the economy, the American economy pretty hard, particularly in places like Southern California and the SUNBELT. And what we see during this era is, sort of the U.S. effort to kind of strengthen our allies around the world during the Cold War resulted in us boosting the economies of places like Germany and Japan. And so one person famously put it, the good news is the Cold War is over. The bad news is that Germany and Japan won. So whether or not the U.S. was really kind of in a stronger position at the end of the Cold War is, I think, pretty debatable. All right, so that kind of wraps things up. And I hope you guys have enjoyed these lectures, and I will see you guys all a little bit later.